Welcome to another great conversation on Think Radio presents Think Planet.
Think Planet is made possible by support from the Western Colorado University School of Environment and Sustainability, empowering future change agents to foster ecologically resilient, economically sustainable, and socially just communities throughout the world.
Become a Think Radio Presents partner at patreon.com, and you'll also get access to premium content you won't find anywhere else. Join us today. My guest today is writer, lawyer, and environmental activist Will Falk. In 2017, Falk was one of several attorneys to file the first ever federal lawsuit seeking legal rights for the Colorado River as a living entity. In other places around the world, activists have succeeded in securing legal protection for natural ecosystems, including Toledo, Ohio, of all places, where voters recently approved a Bill of Rights for Lake Erie. Though Falk's lawsuit was dismissed, the idea remains alive as a way to protect the Colorado River Basin and the millions of people who live there. Falk is the author of How Dams Fall: Stories the Colorado River Told Me. It's due to be released in fall 2019. It's a collection of essays and reflections from Falk's 8-week trip to, as he puts it, get to know his client prior to arguing his case in court. He joins me today by phone from his home in Heber City, Utah. Will, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
I want to start really by hearing your story. I was struck when I looked at your bio that you're spending your time now working on defense of natural systems, natural ecosystems. But before that, you were in the public defender's office after becoming a lawyer, and it just sort of struck me that you've sort of got this defender gene going. Would you say that that's true, that you like this role?
Yeah, that is an interesting way of looking at it. I guess I hadn't looked at it that way. Another layer of that is I played college football and I was a linebacker. So I always played defense, and I guess that is tied into. I guess it starts, the whole defense pattern, I guess, starts with when I was a child, and my parents taught me to always stand up for what I thought I believed in, or and always stand up for the little guy, in just to stand up for the little guy. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I when I was in college, I was an English major actually, and you're reading all these things as an English major, and I think the best, all the great literature always has to do with some sort of truth, always points out problems with the world, and one of the side effects from that for me was I wanted to fix those problems. So I went to law school. I went to the University of Wisconsin in Madison, which is known for being publicly minded. And while I was in law school, I realized that I really wanted to be a public defender. I saw the American criminal justice system as something that is inherently flawed, as something that's institutionally racist. And so I was lucky enough to be hired at the public defender's office in Kenosha, Wisconsin, right out of law school. And I did that for a while before becoming thoroughly burnt out. I was trying to keep my clients out of jail on an individual basis, on a case-by-case basis. And there wasn't a whole lot of room in the public defender's office for working for the kinds of institutional change that I thought was really needed. So I left the public defender's office in 2013, and I really felt like environmental issues were the most pressing issues. It's one thing to have a racist criminal justice system. It's another thing to have the world's fresh water supplies dwindling, having air quality getting worse and worse.
Well, yeah,
because
because
you can't breathe.
those are things that affect everyone, not just a particular class of person or a particular race of person. But it also strikes me that you went from defending people who you could describe as kind of voiceless in society. And, that's one way to put it. It certainly lacked the resources maybe to mount a adequate defense of themselves. But you sort of stepped that game up, that philosophy up to a whole new level. I mean, a river system literally has no voice. How did you make that leap? It seems like you tied those two things together somehow. How did you go from one platform to another? What was the thought process there?
Well, it's one phrase that that's always stuck with me, and I can't remember where I heard it first, but I heard someone say, oppression is always linked to resource extraction. And that is true for whether we're talking about the world's indigenous populations, where before an empire can access resources, they have to clear indigenous peoples off the land. The history of the United States is the history of clearing indigenous peoples off the land. But it's also true for, like you said, natural communities. We dam rivers because we think that we need things like electricity, or that we need water to water our crops. It doesn't matter that some of those crops are peaches in the middle of the desert, that kind of thing. But for me, the Colorado River is I can't think of a being that is more responsible for life in the western United States than the Colorado River. I think there's 40 million people that depend on her for water, which means that they depend on her for life. And in 2017, I helped to file the first American federal lawsuit seeking rights for a major ecosystem, and that was for the Colorado River. And I saw that lawsuit as an opportunity to institutionalize the voice of the river in the American legal system. So in American law, natural communities, natural beings are considered property, and property owners in American law are granted the power to destroy their property. So it's hard to consider something property when you perceive that being as having a voice. Giving the Colorado River a legal voice was a way to combat this idea that the water of the Colorado River is only so many cubic feet of water, is only property for humans to use.
And so when you talk about giving rights to a river system or an other ecosystem, you're talking about legally granting that system the status of being, if I understand it, a living entity. Is that correct? Would you agree with that phrase?
I'm sorry, you broke up a little bit there.
Okay. Well, let me try it again. When you talk about granting rights to an ecosystem like the Colorado River, that's finding some mechanism for legally classifying that system as a living entity. Is that the way you perceive it? Is that the path that you use to argue this case?
Yeah. I think if you look at American legal history and social justice movements in the United States, one common theme is groups that did not have rights, were not considered rights-bearing entities. They always struggle to get rights. Something that's key to their struggle for justice is the struggle for rights. So an easy example is African Americans. When prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, they were considered slaves. They were considered property. So in order to overturn their legal status as property, they had to fight for rights. They had to fight for the 13th Amendment, which says no, actually, people of African descent are not slaves, are not property, but they are citizens with the full rights of citizens in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So there, there's a lot of we draw a lot of analogies from those oppressed classes that have struggled for rights. It's a similar struggle for the natural world. If we're ever going to respect the natural world as living beings who support all of life, then we have to change them from property to rights-bearing entities.
Right, and so I can see on a philosophical level how you could say that the argument is very similar. It's talking about granting rights so that protective measures can be taken. But there are a lot of people who would say, yeah, but we're still talking about people. How do you go into a courtroom and argue that that's not a distinction worth making, that if you're talking about the entire community of species in a particular ecosystem, that it's a legitimate and sort of equivalent argument? What do you base that discussion on?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a great question because the courts have been very resistant to this idea. But there's a couple different ways of looking at it. One, and perhaps the most persuasive argument for judges, at least, has to do with it's kind of a pragmatic argument, and that argument is if you date the modern environmental movement with, let's say, Rachel Carson's publication of the book Silent Spring in 1962. That book is often credited with kind of kicking off the major environmental laws that the United States has. So things like the National Environmental Policy Act and the Endangered Species Act were passed in the late 60s and early 70s. If you look at the health of the North American continent, if you look at the health of the planet, things have only gotten drastically worse since the beginning of the modern environmental movement. And what this seems to say to me, and what it says to rights of nature proponents, is that these old laws, this old regulatory framework that we've built up has failed. It's not working, and we're talking about the total collapse of the life support systems of the planet. So I think when we talk to judges, that's one thing that we push is, look, you as a judge you have this responsibility in government to serve justice. That's what you're sworn to do. How can you serve justice if you look at the major laws that this country have established, and they're supposed to do things like protect endangered species, and yet 200 species a day around the world are still going extinct. We need a new framework, and a rights-based framework seems like the best one.
Well, because it's a similar argument if you said to the judge, we're going to bring a minor child to you that is being abused. What does the law allow to protect that child? That's kind of a rationale being used around the world, is it not? Because you've already mentioned this is a movement. The nature rights movement is happening in lots of places all over the world, and in some places with real success, where they're having legal success in the courts and with referenda and so forth. A part of the rationale is that these systems are like children. They need the kind of support that we would give an abused child. Do you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's not just children, I guess, is one way to look at it. So people hear this idea that we should give rights to a river or give rights to a lake, and they think that this is coming out of La La Land or something. But the American legal system, in fact, the English common law system, so the United States, Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom, for centuries have had these artificial legal entities where things like children, I shouldn't say things, beings like children, who we don't think that they can go into courtroom and represent their own interests. A 5-year-old who is being abused can't step into court and argue on her behalf. So we allow different types of legal ideas. So we allow next friends or guardians to represent children in a more perhaps harsher context or more politically charged context. Corporations in the United States are considered people under the law and have most of the constitutional rights that you or I have. And nobody thinks that a corporation as itself can go into court and argue for itself. It has to have people come in and assert its rights too. So the idea of giving nature rights it's the same idea. No one is saying that a river can make an argument, a constitutional argument to have rights. But we already appoint guardians to children. Why can't we appoint guardians for rivers to do the same thing?
Well, I mean, some people would say, and I'm really interested to hear your comment on this, is that that's what the U.S. Congress is that by passing laws that are intended to protect these ecosystems, the U.S. Congress and elected officials really play that role already. Why is that not good enough?
Well, again, I think at the end of the day, the only thing that matters is the health of the planet. People in 100 years aren't going to ask us whether we created these really clever laws to permit construction projects. What they're going to ask us in 100 years is whether they can drink the water or they can breathe the air.
Right.
And if that's the measure of our success, then we're failing miserably. And for the last 300 years in this country, we've been playing by those old rules. We've been relying on Congress to do the right thing, which in a lot of ways is relying on someone else to do the right thing. We have to beg Congress members to, we have to beg Congress members to even believe that climate change is happening. And I just think that we have wasted a lot of time and resources trying to convince Congress to do the right thing. And it's getting so late in the game that we're going to have to start doing it for them. Passing our own local rights of nature's laws is one way to start to do that.
And so then, who would you ask the court to appoint as the guardian, say, of the Colorado River system, or even a portion of it? How does that work? I mean, at least with the U.S. Congress passing laws, we have an electoral system that gives people a voice. How would this work to set up a guardianship?
So I guess I can use a really recent example. So I think just on Tuesday, the city of Toledo certified an election where the voters in Toledo, Ohio, approved what they call the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, and this law grants rights to Lake Erie, one of the most polluted lakes in the world. But the law grants community members, it grants all individuals within the city, the power to file lawsuits to sue on behalf of Lake Erie. So what they're doing is they're empowering local communities who depend on these ecosystems or natural communities. They allow people within those communities to sue on behalf of the lake. And when they sue on behalf of the lake, they're not. Right now, all we can do is sue to try and get the government to enforce the permitting process, which doesn't always. Well, it rarely results in projects getting stopped. So in this way, they avoid the regulatory system. We don't say, hey, the law says you can't release 10 parts per million of this carcinogen into the lake, and you're violating that. It says no. It really, we're not going to get into this, like how much is safe, how much isn't safe. We're just going to say you are violating the river's rights, just like you wouldn't ask if someone slipped some sort of carcinogen into your coffee in the morning. No one would ask, well, was that a safe level? You would just say, look, I have a right not to ingest poison, right. And that's what the rights of nature proponents are trying to do by empowering communities to enforce the rights of these major ecosystems.
Well, and so that brings up a legal term that you run into over and over with cases like these, and that is standing. A lot of suits get thrown out because it's determined that the people who brought the litigation don't really have standing. Is that what you're talking about, is sort of solving that problem with mechanisms like these?
Yeah, that's a big part of it. Right now, under current American standing jurisprudence, you have to show you can only sue to protect an ecosystem if you can show that you as a human being are directly injured by something happening to that ecosystem. And you're right. It's this rule of standing is often used by the courts to throw out cases. Where a good example is let's say there's a really remote forest that only 2 or 3 people see every year, and the Forest Service makes an announcement that they're going to clear cut that area, and their reasoning is, well, it's remote, no humans ever go there, so we're going to clear cut it. And some concerned citizens try to sue to protect that forest, trying to argue that, well, that forest should live in its own right. It doesn't matter that humans aren't benefiting from the forest right now. Mm-hmm. The forest has a right to exist by itself. Under standing jurisprudence, it's likely that a court would say, look, you're not directly harmed by the cutting of this forest, so it's okay that they cut the forest. So yeah, standing. We're trying to give. You try to give major ecosystems standing so that you don't have to always prove that individual humans, are being injured by some activity.
Even though these days that's actually not a terribly difficult argument. For instance, carbon emissions anywhere in the world can be said to harm everyone on the world, right? I mean, that's actually been argued in courts successfully, where coal mine expansions, for instance, have to account for what does it mean to the whole planet now that we're going to burn this extra coal. And in the case of the Colorado River, for instance, you've mentioned these millions of people that depend on that river. That's not that hard to say that anything that goes wrong with the river affects all of them. But I'm wondering how you would respond to the idea that, well, let me phrase it as a question. Do you worry that this kind of approach basically opens up a Pandora's box of litigation where you could get all sorts of things coming out of the citizens of Toledo, for instance, that may or may not be helpful? Is that a concern to the people in the nature's rights movement?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a concern whenever you're making you're advocating for major change. That is one argument that people make is, we don't know what's going to happen when you start to tinker with these things. And again, I think when we look at history, we just have to face the fact that we're failing miserably, and maybe what we need is way more litigation in environmental things. Maybe we really do need courts to enforce orders against corporations to stop their destructive activities. I think things have gotten so bad, and exploitation of the natural world has become so essential to most of our lives that there's no question that if we want to see a livable planet in a century from now, there's going to be really, really painful changes that are going to happen. I guess I don't know if it would be such a bad thing that we opened up Pandora's box and let all kinds of litigation happen and really make corporations have to think about what they're doing and change what they're doing. And yeah, there's going to be a lot of painful changes, and that's just going to happen.
Well, and a lot of the research and the conclusions of UN panels, for instance, kind of point to the direction, look, it's going to be painful one way or the other. Everybody's going to have to pitch in order to tackle some of these issues. And so that's an interesting point. Can you point to places elsewhere in the world where measures like this have been successful? I'm thinking of Ecuador, for instance, built into the Constitution that ecosystems have rights. Are there other places that you can say, yeah, we're making real progress here, and here's why, and here are the precedents that are being set?
Yeah. So I've already mentioned Lake Erie, and that's really exciting because of the way it involved a ballot initiative. So it was a directly voted on law. So the whole city of Toledo voted, and it turns out that the city of Toledo wants Lake Erie to have rights. I think that's a really strong message in a country that purports to believe in democracy. You have democratic processes demanding rights of nature. So Lake Erie and the city of Toledo in the United States is a place where this is happening. A really great place this is happening too is in New Zealand, where Te Uruvera National Park and the Wanganui River, which runs through the national park, have been recognized by the New Zealand government as being its own person under the law. And it's I think a really important thing to mention about Te Uruvera is just how politically strong the Maori people have remained despite their colonization. And so I think a lot of the initiative, or a lot of the force behind trying to get Te Uruvera rights came from indigenous traditions and indigenous people really fighting for those rights. And I think that we're seeing that rights of nature, indigenous peoples, where there's strong indigenous leadership, rights of nature seem to be more likely to happen. You mentioned Ecuador, which Ecuador wrote the rights of nature into their constitution. I believe that Colombia, the country of Colombia, is negotiating or talking about how they can grant the Atrato River rights. There have been high courts in India that have recognized the rights of the Ganges River. So yeah, there around the world, people are starting to catch on to these ideas and are looking at the situation in their own countries and realizing that their own legal systems have failed them, and that something new needs to take its place.
Have any of these initiatives been around long enough to survive court challenges? In other words, it's one thing to have a Bill of Rights on paper, but it's another thing to be able to actually see that lead to meaningful change, blocking certain projects or enabling others. Is this old enough that we can say, yeah, this is actually starting to work, that challenges in high courts are coming back in favor of these rights declarations?
Yeah, I think it's still getting sorted out for sure. I think that 5 years. I think it was 2014 that New Zealand recognized Teo Rivera as a person. So that's been 5 years, and that in legal terms, that's the blink of an eye.
Right.
The law, especially the common law system that countries like the United States and New Zealand have inherited from the United Kingdom. It takes this development of cases. You need controversies brought before the court so that they can iron out the details.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, in 5 years, there's still a lot of work to be done. Still a lot of questions that need to be answered. But they'll only be answered as these things come before the courts. And again, courts move notoriously slowly.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to take more time for us to see exactly how it'll all play out.
Well, so in the case of the Colorado River, for instance, let's say hypothetically, tomorrow it achieves status as a protected entity, living entity. What are the kinds of things that, if you were granted guardianship, you would immediately go after? What are the practices that you would want to see stop?
Yeah. Well, the first thing in my mind is the Colorado River only rarely flows to the sea. Since the 1960s, it's only reached the sea a handful of times. So the language that we're using, the actual substantive rights that we're trying to get for these ecosystems include the rights to exist, flourish, regenerate, and naturally evolve. So a river exists to flow to the sea. That's what its job is. That's what its role is in the total freshwater water cycle on the planet. So the first thing that I would do is try and figure out how we can make sure that the Colorado River flows to the sea.
Mm-hmm.
Let the Colorado River be a river. That will require some pretty drastic changes. Some of the major dams that are on the Colorado River are going to have to be dismantled. Some of the major reservoirs are going to have to be drained. But again, these are things that if we're going to take rights of nature seriously, there's going to have to be very big changes. So that's one thing. There's other things like I don't think people really understand this, but it's really not individual water use that is the main problem on the Colorado River. So, for example, it's actually close to 70% of the Colorado River's water is used for industrial activities. So big farms, I already mentioned this, but there in western Colorado, where there's major peach growing operations, there's grapes that are being grown on the high plateau of Colorado, and these are really water intensive things that, do we necessarily need peaches in the desert? Do we really need to drink wine? Especially when it means that we're strangling a river to death to do it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, which brings us really to the next topic that I want to ask you about, talking about dams on the Colorado River, and that is your book that's coming out this year, I presume. It's called How Dams Fall. Tell us a little bit about that. That's a very provocative and really intriguing title, How Dams Fall, as if that's something that is not as speculative as it actually is in the real world, the idea of dismantling dams. What are you after in this book?
So the book tells the story. When we initially filed the Colorado River Rights of Nature case in the fall of 2017, I immediately embarked on about 8 weeks of travel along the Colorado River, and the idea was just like an attorney forms an attorney-client relationship with a human being, and the first thing that a good attorney does is ask their client what she needs. And with all the cynicism around lawyers, that is really what lawyers are supposed to do, is ask their client, what do you need? What do you need me to do? So I traveled along the Colorado River for 8 weeks, asking the Colorado River what she needs. What is it exactly that is happening to her that is harming her? And the book is really written in a very lyrical, poetic way. I really take it seriously that I really do believe that the natural world speaks, and my writing is how I listen. And,
yeah, I like the subtitle of the book, which is "Stories the Colorado River Told Me." That's really, really fun.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. And the title, how dams fall, it really, what I learned was that the Colorado River's needs are physical and real. The Colorado River needs to flow to the sea. The Colorado River needs mercury to be taken out of her waters. The Colorado River needs more and more snowpack so that she can replenish herself. And so it's tempting, especially for lawyers like me, to get really tied up into things like rights or things like judges' rulings, these things that are really human constructs. And so how dams fall, dams, there's more than one way that a dam falls. You don't necessarily need a court order to make a dam fall. I think Edward Abbey has written famously about that, and that is some of the allusions that I make in the book, and ultimately, sort of the main point of the book is, yes, we can try and get judges to do the right thing by things like rights of nature lawsuits, but at some point we're going to have to do the right thing for these people, and that might mean more creative ways of freeing the Colorado River.
Well, including ballot initiatives like you saw in Toledo, where that didn't have to go through the courts; it just went to the people. Are there things like that are possible?
Yeah. I think I missed kind of the end there.
Yeah. Well, I just wonder if there, because let's back up and fill in the blanks here. This lawsuit that you keep referring to ultimately failed that time around, right? And so the question was, are there other approaches that don't involve going before a judge that could accomplish some of the same things? Are there plans, for instance, to launch ballot initiatives in communities along the Colorado River that could do some of this?
There are not specific plans to launch ballot initiatives right now that I'm aware of. I think it really what we brought the lawsuit. There was 5 of us that got together to bring the Colorado River lawsuit. And the way it was dismissed was rather forcefully. The Colorado Attorney General threatened the lead attorney on our case. I was not the lead attorney. I'm not licensed in Colorado where we filed the case. They threatened the lead attorney on the case with what are called Rule 11 sanctions, which is basically saying we're going to ask the court to punish you, to fine you for making a frivolous argument. And the attorney's name was Jason Flores Williams. He's based in Denver. And looking at his total practice. He represents a lot of clients pro bono. He was representing us pro bono. He realized that he couldn't take that kind of risk. He couldn't risk having his license revoked for making an argument like this. I think that those in power are going to react forcefully when you start to threaten their power, and that's what happened with us. But the ballot initiatives, I think, are a very powerful way to assert rights of nature because, again, they have these democratic votes. So if everyone in your community says, we really think that the Colorado River should have rights, and the government comes in and says, well, we disagree, what does that say to people when we are supposed to live in a democracy and they vote on something, and then they're told that they can't do that? I think it just sends a really loud message that we don't actually live in a democracy, and that's another really important part of rights of nature and of these lawsuits and of these ballot initiatives, is really waking people up to how democracy works in this country. There are going to have to be more creative ways of trying to arrive at these solutions. Ballot initiatives are part of that, but hopefully people start coming up with more creative ways in the future too.
Well, clearly there's a lot of work left to be done. I really like the idea that a river ought to be able to flow to the sea, and yet that's really not the world we live in. So we have to get about figuring out how to get there, and even in today's environment. And so I appreciate the work that you're doing, and I look forward to your book. I think it sounds like a great approach to tell the story, not just in terms of bar graphs and statistical data, but what do you hear when you sit by the river? So thanks for doing that. Well, I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you. It was truly a pleasure. Sorry, I sometimes miss what you're saying because it's cutting out, but it was truly a pleasure, and thank you very much for inviting me on.
All right, we'll have you back sometime when there's more to talk about.
Oh, I'd love that.
Think Radio Presents is a production of Alan Mortis Media. The show's producer is Isa Forrest. Associate producer, Aaron Lewis.
Thanks for listening. Become a Think Radio Presents partner at patreon.com, and you'll also get access to premium content you won't find anywhere else. To leave a comment on today's show or to suggest a great story for a future episode, visit thinkradiopresents.com. Tune in next week for another great conversation on Think Radio Presents Think Planet.